A new day and another Magnus Carlsen game. It's round 5 of the European Team Championships and Magnus is doing well so far. He's on 3.5 out of 4 on board 1 representing Norway, and in the 5th round he is playing again against a player who is more than 300 points lower rated than him. From Moldova is Ivan Schitco playing with the white pieces. He is a grandmaster, 20 years old, and of course not an easy opponent for Magnus, because these opponents, they are hard to beat and they want to play a solid game. They want to play a good game to make a draw against the world champion. That would be nice. So Magnus will try to give everything in this game, and that leads to very enterprising play. Let's have a look. Schitco playing with the white pieces starts with 1d4. Magnus goes knight f6, and after c4, Magnus, he doesn't play the move he played yesterday against Teufel Kainanen, if I pronounce it well. In that game, he played the move e6, but today he goes for g6. Sharper move. Knight c3, bishop g7, e4, d6. We have the King's Indian defense. It's the sharpest opening against 1d4. Popular opening played in the past by Bobby Fischer, Garry Kasparov, and nowadays Hikaru Nakamura is the leading expert on the black side of this system, and it's one of the best systems to play for a win. So not a surprise, Magnus goes for it. He gives white a nice pawn center, but later on he will look for nice counter chances. Let's have a look. White goes for a popular system with the move h3 to control the g4 square, so never a bishop can come there. But there are other ideas as well. Sometimes white wants to play g4 very fast. But first things first. Black castles, bishop, e3. This is the modern way of playing, and white consciously postpones the development of the knight to f3 as he has other ideas in mind for that particular piece. And now black has to make a decision how to challenge the center, and basically every legal move has been tried here. e5, c5, setups with c6 or a6, whatever, anything is possible here. Knight c6 is a very provocative move, as it does give white the chance to kick the knight away immediately with a move d5, attacking the knight. And the question is, where's the knight going? If it goes to e5, which is the main move, you get a very sharp game, as white brings up another pawn with f4 when the knight has to go back to d7. There's a lot of theory there. I will save that for another time. Magnus, he's not interested in these kind of theoretical battles. He goes for the move knight b4. And the knight itself, it's not doing that much. And after a3, the knight can only go back to a6. But the idea is that, okay, you have possibilities now to bring the knight to c5. And having provoked white playing the move d4, d5, there are additional ideas of challenging that pawn right away. White goes bishop d3, getting the bishop out. The knight comes to c5, so black is even considering to trade off the knight for the bishop. Bishop c2, and now knight fd7. Interesting move, as black frees the diagonal for this bishop on g7, so that at this point white cannot play the move b4 yet to attack the knight, as that hangs the knight on c3. But now you understand white's next move, knight ge2, as the knight overprotects its colleague on c3, and on the next move b4 is likely to be played, but black plays the move a5. This is all kind of very standard King's Indian type of play. Black secures the knight on the c5 square. White castles, and another interesting idea, knight b6. Black hits the pawn on c4 and white defends it with the move b3. Looks scary because the diagonal is now open, but for now everything is well protected. But you always have to look for some sharp ideas. For instance, a4 is a move which could be considered, because if this pawn on b3 is not there, the pawn on c4 could be hanging. However, a4 is not a good move now. It was not played in the game, but I would like to show you why. White has the move b4 to kick the knight away. If the knight goes back, you go bishop d3, and look at these pawns. They are fantastically supported, and very soon there are ideas to open up the queen side. So instead of playing a4, black has to be patient as well. Goes for the move e5. I thought this was a remarkable decision. So if we go back, I think one of the main ideas of this provocative setup is to play c6 or e6 at some point. But Magnus voluntarily closes the diagonal for the bishop. Of course, white has the possibility to take on e6, but trading off your best pawn, giving up your space advantage is usually not the main strategy for white in this opening. Instead, rook b1 was played. So the idea is to prepare the move b4 to attack the knight on c5, and with the move rook b1, you're not allowing the exchange of rooks anytime soon. So black goes back with a knight to d7. That looks like a sad move, but at least white doesn't get a move b4 with tempo. Bishop d3, the bishop comes back to protect the pawn on c4, and white is about to play b4. The knight goes back to c5. Black wants to trade off the knight for the bishop. But the bishop goes back to c2. We get already a silent draw offer. There's a potential repetition of moves. Knight cd7, bishop d3. And this is difficult for Magnus. Well, maybe it's not difficult at all because he knows that he wants to play for a win. He's not interested in repeating the moves and therefore plays f5. That's the sharpest move in the position. And very typical, black is looking for counterplay on the king side. If you get a chance, you will play f4 to attack the bishop, maybe play f3 to attack the knight and to remove the pawn from g2. So white has a choice here how to respond. Well, you can take the pawn on f5, and after g takes f5, a thematical way of playing here would be f4 to put pressure indirectly against the pawn on f5. And white is about to take on e5 probably. If black goes e4, there's bishop c2. And this is a typical structure. Black has a pawn on e4, protected passed pawn. But white has a square on d4 and the knight is looking to jump into e6. I think this would have been a very sharp, interesting idea. But judging from the move played by Schitco, f3, he wants to retain control over the position. He doesn't want to go for an imbalance in pawn structure. He wants to maintain the grip on that pawn chain. So f3 is played. So the idea is that after f4, the bishop comes to f2, and white is very fast in generating counterplay on the queen side. So that's not what black is going to do. Black played the move knight c5, and another important moment. This time, the bishop is about to be taken. If the bishop goes back now to c2, then a4 is a really cool move, because this time you're able to trade off the a for the b pawn, because if white goes b4 to attack the knight, there is knight takes c4. This is a beautiful counterattack. If white takes on c5, the bishop on e3 can be taken. And this is the big difference with the moves f5 and f3 inserted. Had the pawn been on f2, the bishop would have still been protected by that pawn. So this is very nice, interesting play by Magnus. Instead of dropping back with the bishop to c2, Schitco plays b4, gaining space on the queen side. Knight takes d3, queen takes d3, so black at least succeeds in trading off one minor piece. But white is very fast. White can play c5 next, and white wants to open up the queen side. That's something black doesn't want to see happening. Goes back with a knight to d7. The knight is no longer that well placed on b6, trying to control the c5 square, but there follows c5, a takes b4, a takes b4. Black opens up the a file. Who knows, maybe the rook can be useful there at some point. And here we see Magnus shifting the attention to the other side of the board. Knight f6. So the knight is on his way to h5. So here there are various options. I think something like c6 is a very interesting move, trying to create some play on that side of the board. The idea is that if you do take, then you get a nice square on d5 for the knight, and very soon b5, b6. Potential problems regarding that pawn on c7. However, if you play a move like b6, then it's very useful for white to have that pawn on c6. This bishop can not move that easily. White will play rook a1. And potentially white is winning in the long run on the queen side. He has a space advantage and ways to improve its position there. Maybe with the help of piece sacrifices. Who knows, maybe some protected passed pawns can be created later on. Anyway, this didn't happen. Schitco plays it very safe. That's probably his way of playing. He goes rook a1 and black captures on e4, attacking the queen. So black is not minding the potential capture on a8 because there's e takes d3. White has to decide how to recapture. And Understandable if we see Schitco style. He plays it solid. He recaptures with the f-pawn. I'm not sure that is the best move. Maybe it's better to take with a knight. Why it's better to take with a knight? Well, if we purely look at white's pieces, the knights on c3 and e2, they're standing in the way. They are protecting each other. If you do take with a knight from c3, you open up the path for the other knight to come to c3. And I think that's kind of useful for white to try to become a little bit more active. Anyway, f takes e4 was played. Now one pair of rooks was exchanged on the a file and there is knight h5. So here we see that black is about to get the queen into play. Maybe knight f4 is an idea. So white quickly comes back with the rook to f1. Rooks were exchanged. Now the queen comes to f6 with check. And well, there's a choice what to do, how to solve the check here. King g1 is one possibility. But instead, Schitco played here the move bishop f2. And now Magnus plays it active. He tries to generate active play with the move knight f4, attacking the queen on d3. White captured the knight on f4. And here Magnus has two possible recaptures on f4. Decides to take with the e-pawn, creating this imbalance, opening up the diagonal, hitting this knight on c3 with the queen and the bishop. Knight goes to b5. And even though a lot of pieces have been exchanged, the game is really sharp now and white has to watch out. The black queen enters on a1 with check. The king goes to e2. And I think critical moment here. What is black going to do with that pawn on c7? Well, Magnus gave another check on b2. Maybe queen h1 is a very interesting move when play becomes incredibly sharp. Let me show you quickly what may have happened in that case. Knight takes c7, black takes the pawn on g2. And now you have to be careful. Bishop takes h3 is there. White wants to exchange queens. Black captures another pawn. Queens will come off the board. And then white has this idea to play c6. And white is almost there to promote one of its pawns. If you do take on c6 and bishop takes e4, the bishop controls the pawn on c6. But there is b5. It's an incredibly sharp endgame in which black is 2 pawns up. But white's pawns are more dangerous than its counterparts. I think anything can happen in such a case. But I think Magnus felt that's too risky. He didn't go for it. He wanted to give a check with the queen. And the king goes to f3. Very interesting. If you do take the pawn on b4, it's knight takes c7. White is very active and the knight may come to e6. So Magnus had a different idea. With his king on f3, he went for the move g5. So the pawns are joining the attack as well. White takes the pawn on d6 and now Magnus is not going to take back because there's knight takes d6 and the knight hits the bishop right away. But instead there is h5. So there's a mating attack here with the queen, the 3 pawns and the 2 bishops. Now white has to be very careful. If you do take on c7, there is g4 check. There's a big problem because you may take one time, but it doesn't change much. If you take on f4, it's queen takes f2 and mate is happening soon. King g5, queen f6, king has to take the pawn, queen h6 with checkmate. I thought this was very instructive because you see that despite the limited material left on the board, there are still great attacking chances for black with these few pieces. We see g4 is a serious threat, after which the king will be deflected from supporting the bishop. Therefore, the only move here is bishop d4. Attacking the queen, offering the exchange of bishops. And black continues with the move g4 check. H takes g4. Black has a choice to take with a pawn or with a bishop. Well, Magnus took back with the bishop on g4. King takes f4 only move. And now queen takes g2. This is incredibly sharp, guys. There are a lot of things happening right now, especially regarding the pawns on the queen side. Bishop takes g7 was played. King takes g7. And now, what is happening if white would take the pawn on c7? A very logical move, but a huge blunder, as it does allow queen f2 check. And the king has only 2 squares to go to. If you go to g5, it's queen f6 with checkmate. If the king instead goes to e5, it's also queen f6 checkmate. So that is the main idea. There's no time to take this pawn on c7 because of queen f2. That's the main threat. Therefore, white needs to create some space for its king with the move e5. Now, If you play queen f2 check, that's a huge blunder on account of king g5. The king is safe, the pawn covers the f6 square, and on the next move, white is going to enter with the queen on g6. There is no good check here for black, and therefore white's overwhelming pawn center is decisive. Instead of playing the move queen f2, black played here the move king h6. So the king takes away the g5 square. The king cannot go there, the white king. If you do take now on c7, it's queen f2 check. And after king e4, it's bishop f5. Beautiful mating pattern with a queen and bishop. Instead of taking the pawn, they follow the move queen e3. And I think that's a very important move, as the queen controls the square on f2. If you do give a check on h2, it's king e4 with a counter check. So it's not that easy to make progress here. Well, Magnus thought, let's take the pawn on d6. Knight takes d6. And there's not much black can do. He just decided to take the pawn on d5. Everything gets swapped. And now, at least, it's time to calm down a bit. Knight e4, the knight centralizes again. Can always come to f6, attacking the queen. Maybe trade off the knight for the bishop. King went to g6, stepping out of any potential discovered check. King is okay there. Queen b6. Now the white queen is trying to infiltrate somewhere along the 6th rank with a potential check. And Magnus thinks, well, that's something I should not allow. He went back with the queen to c6. And after queen takes c6, the players agreed to a draw here. Because after b takes c6, well, it's just a very even endgame with both sides having one minor piece and two pawns. Likely the pawns are going to be exchanged anyway. There are no realistic winning chances for any side. So Schitco probably played the game of his life, making a draw against world's #1 Magnus Carlsen. Anyway, maybe this was not the most spectacular game you would have hoped for like the other days. But I think it was a very instructive and very tense King's Indian battle with a lot of instructive ideas, especially from the black side, how to generate play, subtle pawn moves on both the queen and the king side. Here we see how dynamic this opening potentially may be. And well, hopefully you learned something how to play the King's Indian as well. Let me know in the comments what you think of this performance. If there's anything else which you think is very special, we should have a look at. Let me know. And very soon more coverage, of course, of Magnus Carlsen games and probably also other games from the European Team Championships. Thanks for watching.